I should make a video about Aristotle. Bees must either 1. Fetch the young, that is, with copulation, then either A, each kind generates its own kind, or B, all the rest are generated by kind generates the other, for example, by C, one kind unites with another kind. Welcome back. Today we're going to be talking about Aristotle. More specifically, about how he is almost certainly the most influential scientist of all time. Aristotle's science and philosophy was the driving force in the Western world for over 2,000 years. And he has works on everything. And I mean everything. Physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, logic, ethics, aesthetics, theater, poetry, music, rhetoric, economics, politics, and government. So why is it that the only thing you've heard of him, if anything at all, was that he's just some old toga-wearing Greek guy? In this next series of videos that I make, I want to break down the context in which Aristotle lived and what his science and beliefs actually entailed. Finally, I'm going to address just why he was so influential and why you haven't heard nearly enough about him. If you've never heard of him before, Aristotle was kind of like that kid in school who was better at sports than you, he had more friends than you, he had more money than you, he looked better than you, his parents loved him more than you, he was able to formulate Bryson. Aristotle was good at pretty much everything. So why is it that despite the litany of works that he produced, he's not as well known as he should be? I don't know why, but I'm going to try to fix that a little bit with this video. The goal of this series is to explain Aristotle's belief a little bit and argue why he was the most influential, hands down, the most influential scientist of all time. And bear with me here, because this definitely gets into the weeds. First, we need to talk about the context that Aristotle was working and living in. Most of this information comes from David Lindbergh's book, The Beginnings of Western Science. I'm going to link that down in the description below. Aristotle was born in 384 BCE in the northern Greek town of G.E.R to a privileged family. When he was 17, he went to Athens to study under Plato at his academy for 10 years. After that, he spent a while cruising around Asia Minor, studying biology. He went on to tutor the young Alexander the Great. Think about that. He tutored one of the most famous generals in history, and I doubt you even know that. After tutoring young Alexander, he returned to Athens, where he set up his own academy, the Lyceum, where he worked and studied until his death. But before we can get into what Aristotle actually believed, we have to do a little bit of background digging into what the philosophers and scientists that came before him were preoccupied with. If you were an ancient Greek philosopher, some would say pre-Socratic philosopher, because that's who I'm actually talking about, you probably had two questions on your mind. The first was, is the material world real? That is the world that you and I are sitting in and seeing and smelling and watching this video in actually real? And the second question was, can change actually occur? Does anything really change? First, I'll break down what they thought about change, and then I'll go on to the reality of the material world. For some reason, these ancient Greek philosophers were really caught up on whether things could actually change or not. It's like an obsession you had when you were in elementary school. For me, it was collecting silly bands. You know, those bands that were rainbow colored and in the shape of animals? It may seem silly now, but at the time, it was really, really important, whatever was going on with those bands. Everything was put in the context of those bands, even. The bands determined how cool you were, what you did at recess, what you asked your parents to buy you. All of that was massively important to you when you were in elementary school. The problem of change to ancient Greeks was much the same as the problem of any trend or obsession you had in school. If you wanted to be an ancient Greek philosopher or have a philosophical system, you needed to address if and how change could occur in the world. It all started with Heraclitus, born around 500 BCE, who believed that the only constant in the world was change. On this, he was famously quoted as saying, "No man ever steps in the same river twice." Just as a quick side note, it's hilarious when I was researching for this video how much Heraclitus hated other people. He said that he was smarter than 10,000 people combined. He also said that people were as ignorant as dogs. He also said that Homer, the guy that started literature, the guy that created Greek religion, Heraclitus says that he deserved to be beaten. So what does old Heraclity Tighty Whitey do? Well, he goes up to the mountains, proceeds to eat a diet of herbs and grass, gets dropsy, covers himself in cow manure in the hot sun, and dies. Ha 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 ha. Crazy, right, guys? Not relatable at all. Anyway, Heraclitus was likely the person who kicked off talking about change, and the next person to respond to him was Parmenides, who firmly denied that change was possible at all. Parmenides thought that change was impossible because how could something go from not existing to existing? Or more clearly, how could you get something from nothing? This argument is also great for anything that you don't want to do. Oh, you want me to wash the dishes in the sink? Yeah, that would be really good. They're very dirty and have been in there for a few days, man. Then explain to me how something can be nothing. Change is obviously impossible, so it would be pointless for me to do anything. You're a bad roommate. The question of change then set the stage for Greek philosophers coming after Parmenides and Heraclitus. The last bit of background we have to address is how Aristotle's teacher, Plato, addressed the question of change and how he addressed the question of the realness of the material world. See, Plato believed in the world of forms. The world of forms is basically where the perfect version of anything that you can think of existed. For example, the bed or chair that you're probably resting on has a corresponding perfect copy of a chair or bed in the world of forms. You can think of things in the world of forms like, well, Chipotle compared to other restaurants. Perfect in every single way. Look, I like Chipotle, alright? Everything has a form. There is a perfect form of every person, car, and book. Every category of thing that you can think of has a corresponding perfect copy in the formal world. Through this formal world, Plato addresses both the question of the realness of our material world and the question of whether change can occur. Plato believed the material world, as a reminder that's the world that you and I live in, to be less real than his world of forms. This was because objects in our world are imperfect and transitory compared to their perfect copies in the formal world. And since our world is just an imperfect replica of the formal world, to Plato, that makes our world much less important and much less real than the formal one. As a consequence of this, Plato didn't trust human sense perception, believing that it would lead us astray. See, our senses could give us information on our material world, but they wouldn't actually reveal any information about the formal world. Since truth only came from the formal world, using your sensory organs might delude and trick yourself into believing you were gaining true knowledge when you really were not at all. This was important to Plato because one of his fundamental goals was to seek out and learn universal and overarching truths. And the only place to find these truths was through the formal world. Plato also used this world of forms as a response to Parmenides about the question of change. Plato argued that the world of forms was perfect in every way, and part of what made up this perfectness of the formal world was the fact that it was unchanging. You know, I really think this world of forms is starting to sound like me. Unaging. Handsome.
Perfect in every way. Going to live to the heat death of the universe to carry out my evil plot to take over the world.
Since the formal world was perfect in part because it didn't change, it paved the way for our material world to experience change. This was because Plato argued that the world we live in was imperfect. And part of what comprised this unperfectness was the fact that the world changes. For example, there might be one perfect Fortnite player in the world of forms, and all other Fortnite players, you and I, are different because we are imperfect replicas of this one formal Fortnite player. Getting dubs every day, baby! That was maybe one of the longest digressions ever made, but it did set us up with a good framework to examine Aristotle's methodology for science and how he interacted with his predecessors. For the remainder of this video, I'm going to talk about what Aristotle believed about the realness of our material world, and I'm going to talk about how he addressed Parmenides' question of change. Aristotle rejected Plato's idea of the formal world and its implications. For instance, the world that we can sense is fake. He rejected it with the same vigor with which Ryan Gosling rejects his cereal. And bear with me because this is where the weeds really start. Aristotle embraced the material world by having it be composed of subjects and properties. Properties are just the characteristics that subjects can have. For instance, red, hot, cold, light, or heavy. Subjects were what the properties impressed themselves on. In other words, subjects became the matter which made up objects, and the properties that they have gave them their form. For example, a gamer might be cool, fast, epic, powerful, and chock full to the gills full of LED lights. But matter itself still must be present to serve as the subject for the form that is gamer. Lastly, the matter itself, that is the stuff making up the vessel of said gamer, brings no properties itself to the union with whatever the form is. Because we're able to use our senses to grasp the attributes that make gamers gamers, over time and through repeated observation, a dedicated observer, say my mom desperately trying to connect with me, could come to figure out the form or definition of a gamer. That is, my mom would come to understand all the attributes making me take the form gamer. And here the key word is observation, because Aristotle believed you could find truth through observation, truth through what your senses perceived. He believed that the world, the same world that you and I are sensing right now, was real. Now, don't get me wrong here. Don't you get me wrong here. Aristotle, like Plato, believed in fundamental and overarching truths. He just thought that the truth could be found through the material world, and not the formal world that Plato was obsessed with. Now, on to how Aristotle addressed the problem of change. Aristotle believed that change was real, and he argued for it in a few key ways. The first was that form could change, but matter would always remain the same. As a quick review, even though we just talked about it, because I know it's complicated, matter, the stuff that makes things up, remains the same, while the properties or form that impresses itself onto that matter is what actually changes. This allowed for Aristotle's system to support both stability and change. As a quick analogy, come with me to Build-A-Bear Workshop. It's 2007, life's good, you've just gotten an Auntie Anne's pretzel from the mall, and you're going to Build-A-Bear. The stuffing that you put inside the bears, that's the matter. Doesn't matter, it can't change, it's always those cotton little fluff balls. But the cloth or wrapping you put on the outside of the teddy bear, which makes whatever teddy bear or stuffed animal you're getting them, that's what's able to change, and that's what could be considered the property or form. Aristotle further argued that change always occurred between two opposites. For example, wet things getting drier or cold things getting hotter. This was an attractive option for Aristotle because it allowed for an orderly system that wasn't random, even in the midst of change. Now wait just a second, you, a stickler Pyramidian, say. This still doesn't answer how something could come from nothing. How do you answer that one, old Aristotle? Aristotle addressed this problem by adding a category to the states of being. See, Parmenides and those before him believed that there were only two types of being. That is, being and non-being. Aristotle added a third to these two, of potential being. This allowed change to occur from something that had potential being to actual being without having to have something come from nothing. A great way of thinking about this would be a bug larva. So when a ladybug larva turns from larva into a ladybug, it isn't something out of nothing, it's using its potential being as a larva to come into its full being as a ladybug. So to recap, two of the most salient questions that Aristotle had to address during his time was, is the material world real? And does change occur at all? And if so, how? Aristotle believed that the material world was real, and since it was real, our sense perception of it could lead to overarching truths. For the question of change, Aristotle argued that the stuff that makes things up never changed, but that their properties could and do. He further addressed the problem by arguing that being and non-being were not the only options. Things could potentially be also, meaning that things did not have to come from nothing. Please remember, history is far more messy, more complex, and most importantly, more interesting than I could ever discuss in one video. Keep a lookout for the next video in this series where we're going to be talking about how Aristotle viewed the natural world and what his science actually was. If you enjoyed watching this video, please think about liking and subscribing. I work hard on them and it'd make me feel good to know that people were watching and enjoying them. Thank you very much for watching and have an excellent day.